Hello, welcome to End or N-Gauge Model Railway. Since my last scenic update video, I've continued with developing the card-based tunnel portal. The first improvement was to the wing wall, by making the texture wrap around all edges of the wall and by making some capping stones. The capping stones were another simple drawing in Inkscape with some manual variation in the colours of individual stones. I wrapped these around a thin slice of 0.5mm card, but it resulted in poorly defined edges to the stones, and a slightly wobbly look. I think the 0.5mm card is just a bit too flimsy to use for smaller elements like this. To give a bit of texture to the stones, I pressed the blade into the lines between them. On any one surface that worked relatively well when the light caught it at a good angle, but it didn't look right where the sides of the stones joined the top. I wanted to change the colours in the brick texture to make it less blue, so decided to enhance my colour setting program a little bit. It now takes an SVG file that's just for providing the colour palette and relative probabilities of the colours. In the palette file, the colour of each rectangle is a colour option and the area of the rectangle gives that colour's probability of being chosen. This makes it very quick to set colour options and gives an easy way to visualise the relative probabilities. It also means I can easily save and reuse different colour palettes. Having made new textures and shapes to print, I then ran into strange printing issues from Inkscape. Basic shapes were fine, but cropped textures were either being clipped in strange places or not printed at all. This problem did also exist last time around, but I was able to print the top third or so of the page without issue. Similar issues occurred when printing to a PDF file. Sometimes it would look fine in that PDF, but then go wrong when I tried to print that PDF. Reading some articles online, it seems that Inkscape is well known for having printing problems. After experimentation, I found that exporting to PDF, rather than printing to PDF, along with setting the background to a solid colour, resulted in PDF files that would print as intended. A few days after arriving at this solution, I noticed Michael of Chandwell saves his Inkscape files to PDFs before printing. He mentioned that in his 3rd of April video, and no doubt has mentioned it in previous videos. The resulting brick texture looked worse than before. It had a very obvious vertical striping effect in the brick mortar lines. One of the reasons for making my own textures was to avoid repeating patterns, so this was a major failure. I wonder if it's got something to do with rounding errors between exporting the texture to a PNG image file and then exporting that from an Inkscape drawing into a PDF. In both cases, I set a high dots per inch resolution, but perhaps I need to experiment with different values. By this point, I was a bit bored of issues in getting my digital creations to print properly, so moved on to some more physical construction. To make a course of jutting out bricks, I had made another brick texture that was 3 bricks high. That was roughly 1.5mm, so I glued a strip of 0.5mm card to 1mm card and then glued its thin edge to the paper texture. I found that even with printed guidelines and my best efforts at accuracy with my ruler and craft knife, scoring the paper texture first rarely results in it fitting well to the card. Instead, once the 3 courses of brick were glued to the card, I used the card itself as my scoring ruler for the texture folds. I then sliced the top off the tunnel portal and glued the jutting out courses of bricks onto its main section. Looking back at it afterwards, I could see it had too much of an overhang. In the first portal prototype build, I included the arch stones in the main texture because I'd based them on photos of Dinmore Tunnel, in which they're flush with the bricks. But it looked just too flat on the model, so I decided to print them on a separate sheet for a bit of 3D effect. I would have been happy for that to be attached as a single piece of paper, but it's not possible to draw a texture on an arch that can wrap around the inside of the arch. The sections that go along the inside need to be rectangles, but on a single 2D texture they have to be wedge shapes, which will leave triangular gaps when folded back. To get around that, I split my arch drawing apart into individual wedges and added rectangles beneath them for the foldbacks. I then cut each of them out individually and overlaid them on the portal. That didn't work as well as I'd hoped. At the very edge of the shape, some of them had a little tinge of colour bleed from the printing, typically a thin line of magenta or cyan. Cutting the pieces slightly small to remove those lines, and to avoid having a thin strip of white paper, resulted in pieces that were too small and left too much of a gap. To try disguising areas of incorrect colour, I used a bluish-grey watercolour pencil, but even with only the tiniest amount of water on it, it soaked into the paper and completely messed up the printed area. I also wasn't able to get a suitably fine line with the pencil, resulting in large areas of mismatched colour, so that approach isn't one I'll try again. However, I did like the 3D effect of the stones, I just needed to widen the drawings of them slightly and remove the gap between the face of the stone and the wraparound part to solve most of the problems I'd had. Whilst I was doing that, I significantly extended the length of the wraparound part so it could reach all the way around the 2mm card and onto the back. To experiment with enlargement, I just changed the scaling when printing, with a first guess of 5% bigger. Rather than cut a whole new tunnel portal, which takes quite a while, I overlaid these individual stones on the original portal to see if they were about the right size. I still needed to hide the white edge of the paper. I tried a normal graphite pencil, but the paper was too flimsy when loose, and just didn't seem to be affected when glued in place. I did later try after making the pencil much sharper, but the whiteness remained. The size was quite good. Cutting slightly within the shapes resulted in pieces that fitted together closely and didn't have any edge colour issues. Having done several, I think they were actually too close, losing some of their 3D effect, so perhaps a slightly smaller size would be better. I only attached them to half of the arch, and from some angles I don't think it's obvious that one side is different to the other. That's partly because the original texture does do some wrapping around, which adds a bit of a 3D effect. The whiteness between the stones isn't a problem because I think it actually looks like mortar lines when visible, but I still need to find a way to remove it from the top of the stones because there it just makes them look like bits of paper. For the portal with the lines of sticking out bricks, I glued the top on, but it wouldn't stick flush with the horizontal card. There's actually enough of a gap to see right through. I think this might be partly because the 2mm card was hard to cut, and I didn't manage to keep the knife vertical when cutting. It's also possible the angle of the cut varies across the length of the wall. To try to overcome that, I stuck 2 copies of cutting template to 1mm card to see if making 2 layers of that would work any better. Eventually, some higher quality printer paper arrived, 110 GSM matte photo paper, so I printed a high-resolution texture onto that with what seemed to be the highest available print quality settings. On this occasion, printing directly from Inkscape worked. As I'd hoped, that did result in a significantly better result, with each individual brick clearly visible and no areas that looked striped or weird in any other ways. The colours also looked a lot more like what was on my computer screen. I don't know what made the biggest difference, since there are several things I changed compared with the previous printouts, but I suspect it was the paper. It cost £4.78 for 100 sheets, which is not expensive. Cutting 2 layers of thinner card didn't really help in the end. Getting them exactly the same dimensions was beyond my cutting skill, and overall the cutting took longer, so if I need 2mm thickness again, I'll just use 2mm card. With high quality texture prints, I made another portal and pair of wing walls. For the sticking out course of bricks, I held the strip of card in some helping hand clamps to give me a better chance of getting the centre course of bricks to be in the centre of the card, and that was fairly successful. A problem I've been running into a lot is that the card doesn't stay straight or flat, especially once there's glue on it. It usually warps a bit or a lot. For the arch this time around, I didn't print a wraparound on the first layer, and also cut that layer slightly wider than the hole in the card, so it wouldn't interfere with the wrapping around of the separate stone textures. I scaled each of the arch stone shapes in Inkscape by 4%, and then cut and attached them individually as before. This time around they didn't make a crisp edge around the arch for some reason, possibly because I didn't have that first texture layer going right up to the edge, and because that layer is now made from thicker paper, but I think they still look okay. Disappointingly, the main arch section warped a fair bit. I don't think it will be noticeable in situ on the layout, so decided to carry on, but to prevent the same from happening to the wing walls, I put weights over them after gluing their textures on. The next day, I found their colours had changed a fair bit, so that approach causes more of the glue's moisture to soak into the texture and affect it, so I can't use that approach going forwards. I experimented with cutting individual top stones and attaching them to some card, but it's a slow process and was resulting in inconsistent gaps between the stones, because it seems I couldn't cut them into perfect rectangles. The edges also weren't crisp enough and there didn't seem to be a noticeable 3D effect, so I switched to using thicker card and wrapping the texture around as a whole. I also changed the stones to a more grey colour, which I think fits in better than the dark beige. I was able to curve this line of stones to match the warped shape of the wall because the thinly applied PVA glue gives several seconds where I can still move things around and then goes tacky quite quickly, which is very useful. Having settled on the kind of angle I'd like for the wing wall, I attached that with some bracing cut from scraps of 2mm card. I hadn't tried to cut the end of the wing walls at an angle again, but because of the warping of the card it wouldn't sit completely flush with the main wall. There are small gaps between them, but if there's no light coming from behind, I think it doesn't stand out too badly there, so I decided to live with it. I then made capping stones for the wing walls, which took a few attempts because of various mistakes. To get crisper folds and textures, I switched to offsetting the scoreline slightly from the thing it's going to wrap around. That seems to help avoid it curving around as much. I did try cutting the card for one of the sections of stone courses at an angle to avoid gaps to the other sections. That just about seemed to work. I used scissors for those cuts. One of the sections of capping stone had a very noticeable gap to the wall below it. That's possibly a discrepancy in the heights of the layers of card that make up the wing wall, but also possibly a result of wrapping the brick texture around. Maybe it would be better not to wrap the brick texture around after all, in areas where there'll be a direct join. Later, I was able to cut a single course of bricks and glue that in place. It was very fiddly to get in place and didn't sit in place perfectly, but it looks better than the big gap did. Throughout all of this work with the high quality textures, I found that a little bit of handling results in damage to their finish, as if tiny bits of ink are chipping off. I intend to somehow touch up the worst areas later on, but before that need to give everything a coat of ultra matte varnish. I was convinced I bought some 2 or 3 years ago, but I can't find any physical or digital evidence that I actually did, and likewise spare blades for my craft knife, which is now fairly blunt compared to how it should be. So I've recently placed orders and I'm waiting for them to arrive. I had hoped to at least complete the tunnel portal itself by now, with the tunnel lining and integration into the landscape to come later, but it's been a slow process and I've had to have more tries at things than I'd guessed would be needed. I also have to record the audio for these videos both when I have time and whilst the house is quiet for a while, and those things don't combine very often, so sometimes I have to just take the opportunity or it will be another week before I can start video production. I also need to have my script written before the recording opportunity materialises. At the time of writing, the tunnel portal isn't far off being structurally complete, and assuming the varnish doesn't destroy it in some way, I'll soon be able to try some visual touching up and weathering. That's all for this one though. Bye bye!